The sun hung low over the rugged hills of Greece, casting long, sharp shadows across the land that once trembled beneath the boots of Spartan warriors. For centuries, the name Sparta had been synonymous with power, discipline, and fear. Their phalanxes were unstoppable, their warriors molded from birth to embrace pain, duty, and death. But by 371 BC, that unshakable image was beginning to crack. The Peloponnesian War had ended with Sparta triumphant, but their empire, built on iron and intimidation, was already rotting from within. The city of Thebes, long humiliated and kept under Spartan control, was rising again, and among its citizens burned a desire for revenge. Thebes was no longer content to bow to Spartan dominance. They wanted justice, they wanted freedom, and in the shadows of Mount Cithaeron, a new kind of general was preparing to give it to them, a man named Epaminondas. He was nothing like the Spartans, not born into military might, not trained in endless wars. Epaminondas was a philosopher as much as a soldier, a man who saw war as a chessboard where intelligence could shatter brute strength. He studied Pythagoras, talked about virtue and strategy, and believed that true power came not from fear, but from unity. His enemy, King Cleombrotus I of Sparta, could not have been more different. A commander of 1,000 campaigns, leading men who had been bred for combat since childhood. When the two armies finally met near a small town called Leuctra, history would remember it as the day the unthinkable happened, the day Sparta fell. But before Leuctra, there was tension, betrayal, and arrogance. Years earlier, Thebes had dared to challenge Spartan control. They formed the Boeotian League, an alliance of smaller cities that rejected Spartan authority. In response, Sparta invaded Theban territory, crushing resistance wherever it appeared. Yet every act of oppression only fueled the fire. When the Spartan army occupied Thebes, Epaminondas watched his homeland humiliated. His friends were killed or enslaved. His city lived under the shadow of foreign boots. And in that humiliation, he made a silent vow to destroy the myth of Spartan invincibility. By 371 BC, that moment had come. The Greek world was restless. Athens, once the great rival of Sparta, had grown weary of war. Corinth and Argos, former allies, were fractured. But Thebes was sharpening its sword. Epaminondas knew he was outnumbered. Sparta could call upon 10,000 men, hardened warriors, each one trained to kill without hesitation. Thebes had only around 6,000. But within those 6,000 were the sacred band, 300 elite soldiers bound not only by loyalty, but by love. Each pair of warriors was connected by a personal bond, willing to fight and die for one another. It was a revolutionary concept, and it would change everything. The tension grew as news spread that King Cleombrotus was marching north with the Spartan army. Villages burned, farmers fled, and in Thebes the council met in secret. Some wanted to surrender to avoid annihilation. Others whispered of divine prophecy, that the gods themselves were about to turn against Sparta. Epaminondas stood before them, calm and unshaken, and spoke, "If we kneel today, our children will never stand. Let us meet Sparta, not as slaves, but as free men." The room fell silent. The decision was made. Thebes would fight. The march to Leuctra was brutal. The summer heat was merciless. Dust rose from the soldiers' sandals as they crossed the Boeotian plain. Scouts returned with grim reports. The Spartans were close, their red cloaks visible on the horizon. Each man in Epaminondas's army knew the odds. To face Sparta in open battle was almost suicide. Yet the Thebans trusted their leader, for he saw patterns others could not. He planned to turn the very structure of Greek warfare on its head. Traditionally, Greek armies fought in phalanxes, tight formations of shield and spear, line against line, strength against strength. The Spartans were masters of this. Their right flank, where their best warriors stood, usually overwhelmed the enemy left, breaking their formation and crushing morale. Every Greek general knew this. Every Greek general, except one, accepted it as inevitable. Epaminondas refused. As his troops camped on the fields near Leuctra, he studied the terrain. He noted the slopes, the wind, the narrow valley that could channel the enemy's advance. Then he made his move. Instead of matching the Spartans line for line, he formed an oblique phalanx, concentrating his best warriors, especially the sacred band, on his own left flank, directly opposite the Spartan elite. He would throw everything he had at the strongest point of the enemy line. If he could break their right, he believed the entire Spartan army would collapse. It was madness or genius. That night, as campfires flickered under a violet sky, Theban soldiers whispered prayers to the gods. The air smelled of sweat, oil, and anticipation. Some sharpened spears in silence. Others sang low songs of home. In the distance, the faint glow of Spartan fires burned like eyes watching from the dark. Epaminondas stood apart, gazing toward the horizon. His friend and commander of the sacred band, Pelopidas, approached. "They say no army has ever beaten Sparta in open battle," Pelopidas said quietly. Epaminondas smiled faintly. "Then we'll be the first." Meanwhile, in the Spartan camp, confidence reigned. King Cleombrotus's officers laughed at the idea of Theban resistance. "We will crush them before sunset," one said. To them, Thebes was a nuisance, a city of farmers and philosophers pretending to be soldiers. But among the younger Spartans, there was unease. They had heard of the sacred band, of men who fought not for glory or conquest, but for each other. It was something alien to Spartan thought, and that difference, though invisible in the night, would soon carve its mark in blood. As dawn approached, a heavy silence fell across the plain. The sound of armor being fastened echoed like distant thunder. Shields gleamed, spears stood tall. The sun began to rise, golden and merciless, over what would soon become one of the most decisive battles in Greek history. Epaminondas mounted his horse, riding down the line of men, his voice steady. "Today we fight not for conquest, but for freedom. The eyes of Greece are upon us. Let them see what it means to stand against tyranny." From the opposite ridge, Cleombrotus raised his spear high, signaling his troops to advance. The ground trembled as 10,000 Spartans moved forward in perfect rhythm, the sound of their march like the beating of war drums. The stage was set. Two worlds, Sparta, the embodiment of strength and order, and Thebes, the voice of defiance and innovation, stood ready to collide. And when they did, one of them would fall forever. The morning air over the plains of Leuctra was thick with dust and tension. From the Spartan lines came the low thud of synchronized steps, shields clashing in rhythm, spears bristling under the rising sun. 10,000 men moved as one, an army forged by centuries of conquest, their red cloaks rippling like waves of blood. Opposite them, the smaller Theban force stood in formation, silent and unmoving, the gleam of their armor glinting faintly through the haze. 6,000 hearts beat faster, not with fear, but with resolve. Epaminondas rode slowly along his lines. He had positioned the Theban army in an unconventional way. His left flank, thickened with 50 ranks of men, faced directly toward the Spartan right, where King Cleombrotus commanded the elite warriors of Laconia. Traditionally, armies kept their lines even, but Epaminondas had done the opposite. He weakened his right flank, leaving it thin and fragile, a deliberate bait. His entire strategy depended on one gamble, breaking the Spartan right before his own right could collapse. To his men, it looked like madness. To Sparta, it looked like an insult. The Thebans stood in silence as the Spartan advance began. The sound was terrifying, thousands of bronze greaves pounding in unison, the rhythmic clang of shields striking spear shafts. A wall of red and bronze advanced relentlessly, filling the horizon. In the center of the Spartan line marched the king himself, Cleombrotus I, his helmet crest tall, his spear gleaming. Around him, the Hippias, Sparta's royal guard of 300 chosen men, veterans of countless battles. They had never known defeat. They believed they never would. Epaminondas dismounted, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Hold," he said quietly. "Not yet." Pelopidas, leading the sacred band, nodded from his position on the left. The two men exchanged a glance, one of trust, of shared understanding. The plan depended on perfect timing. The distance closed. 300 meters. 200. The Spartans broke into a run, their battle cries echoing across the plain. Ares! Ares! The war god's name thundered as they surged forward, a living wave of iron. Epaminondas raised his arm and dropped it. The Theban trumpets blared. In that instant, the left flank of the Theban army, 50 ranks deep, lurched forward as one. The phalanx moved not to defend, but to strike. The ground shook as thousands of shields slammed together. When the two armies met, the sound was like mountains colliding. The Spartan line was stunned. They had expected the enemy to crumble under their charge. Instead, they met an unyielding wall of Theban shields and spears that pressed forward with crushing weight. The Theban formation was deeper, heavier, and angled to drive straight into the Spartan right. It was a bold, almost suicidal maneuver, one that would decide the fate of Greece. For the first time, the Spartans were on the defensive. Spears shattered, shields splintered, men screamed. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. The Theban left, anchored by the sacred band, surged forward, using their numbers in depth to push the Spartan right backward step by step. Pelopidas shouted commands through the din, his voice cutting through the clash of steel. His soldiers fought like a living organism, every man trusting the one beside him completely. They didn't fight for glory or for loot. They fought for each other, and for the dream of freedom that Epaminondas had ignited. Meanwhile, Cleombrotus's men struggled to adapt. The traditional Spartan phalanx was designed for precision and symmetry, but the Theban wedge disrupted that rhythm. The Spartans found themselves squeezed, unable to maneuver. Still, their discipline held. Cleombrotus pushed his guard forward, spearing through the Theban front. Bodies fell on both sides, and the ground grew slick with blood. Epaminondas watched from behind, his eyes cold and calculating. "Advance the center," he shouted. The middle of the Theban line moved up to reinforce the left, adding even more pressure against the Spartan elite. His weakened right flank, meanwhile, stayed back, refusing the fight, delaying contact with the Spartan left. It was an innovation unseen in Greek warfare. The oblique order, the slanted formation that concentrated power on one side. It was working. Slowly, the tide began to turn. The Spartans, forced backward, struggled to keep formation. Cleombrotus himself was wounded, struck by a spear through his thigh, then another in his side. He fell, blood pouring down his armor. His bodyguards tried to carry him away, but his fall sent a shock through the Spartan ranks. For the first time in generations, a Spartan king had fallen in battle. The rumor spread like wildfire. "The king is dead! The king is dead!" The Thebans heard it too, and their morale surged. Epaminondas seized the moment. "Push forward," he roared. "Break them!" The Theban left erupted in fury. Spears drove forward in perfect rhythm, shields locking tight, every step forcing the Spartans farther back. The sacred band fought at the very tip of the wedge, cutting through the enemy like a spearhead of living steel. Pelopidas, drenched in blood, led from the front, his sword flashing in the sunlight. Every strike, every cry, was an act of defiance against centuries of Spartan dominance. The Spartan right crumbled. The rest of their army, seeing the elite collapse, began to falter. Confusion spread. The phalanx, once the most disciplined force in the ancient world, was breaking apart. The Spartans on the left, who had not yet engaged, hesitated. They looked across the field and saw something they had never seen before: Spartans retreating. By midday, the battle was decided. The Theban wedge had pierced straight through the Spartan line. Bodies littered the ground, thousands of fallen soldiers, their armor gleaming under the cruel sun. The dust hung thick, turning the sky a dull bronze. The smell of blood and metal filled the air. Epaminondas stood among his men, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. Around him, Theban warriors shouted in disbelief and triumph. They had done the impossible. They had broken Sparta. But the victory came at a cost. Hundreds of Thebans lay dead, many from the sacred band. Pelopidas himself was wounded but alive. As he limped toward Epaminondas, The two embraced briefly, surrounded by the cries of victory. "Is it over?" Pelopidas asked. Epaminondas looked toward the fleeing Spartan ranks, the remnants of the once great army scattering toward the hills. "No," he said quietly. "It has only begun." He knew what this moment meant. Leuctra was not just a victory, it was a revolution. The myth of Spartan invincibility had been shattered, and with it, the political order of Greece. For centuries, Sparta had ruled through fear. But fear, like any weapon, loses its power once it fails. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows over the field of Leuctra, Epaminondas walked among the dead. He stopped beside the body of a fallen Spartan officer, staring at the crimson cloak now soaked in dust and blood. "Even the strongest walls," he murmured, "can fall with a single crack." The Theban soldiers gathered, exhausted yet euphoric. They had faced the impossible and survived. But as they looked around at the devastation, a chilling thought began to settle. Sparta would not forget this. The world had changed that day, and every city-state in Greece would soon have to choose sides. Epaminondas mounted his horse once more, gazing toward the horizon. "Let them come," he whispered. "Let them all come." For now, Thebes stood victorious. But the war for the soul of Greece had only just begun. The battlefield of Leuctra was silent now, except for the moans of the wounded and the distant cry of crows circling above. The earth was scarred with the tracks of war, shattered shields, broken spears, and the bodies of once proud warriors lying where they had fallen. Smoke rose in thin, ghostly lines from small fires that still burned across the plain, the remnants of discarded torches and destroyed banners. For centuries, the Spartans had been seen as gods of war, unbeatable, unbreakable, eternal. But on that field in Boeotia, under the merciless sun, the myth had died. Epaminondas stood amid the ruins of Sparta's army, his armor dented and blood-stained. His gaze swept across the desolation. This was not just a victory, it was a transformation. The world he had known was ending, and a new one was being born. The invincible Spartans were no more. He turned to his officers. "Gather the wounded. Treat the prisoners fairly," he ordered. "Let the world see that Thebes conquers not only with strength, but with honor." Pelopidas approached, his arm in a sling, his face pale from blood loss but eyes still sharp. "You did it," he said softly. "You destroyed the legend." Epaminondas shook his head. "No. They destroyed themselves, their arrogance, their blindness. They believed the gods favored only them. Today, the gods have chosen differently." Meanwhile, across Greece, the shockwaves spread faster than any messenger could travel. In Athens, the news reached the agora like a thunderclap. Citizens and soldiers alike stopped in disbelief as heralds announced the impossible. The Spartans had been defeated, crushed by Thebes. The older men muttered prayers, remembering the centuries of Spartan dominance, while the younger ones shouted with joy. "The tyrants of Greece are no more," some cried, but others feared what might come next. A power vacuum was always dangerous, and Thebes, though victorious, was an unknown force in the balance of the Greek world. In Corinth, merchants whispered nervously. "If Sparta can fall," they said, "who can stand secure?" The entire Peloponnesus trembled. Cities once loyal to Sparta now reconsidered their alliances. The old order, the Spartan hegemony that had ruled since the Peloponnesian War, was crumbling before their eyes. Back in Sparta, the reaction was one of disbelief and horror. Messengers rode through the city gates carrying the grim tidings. King Cleombrotus was dead, and more than 1,000 of the best Spartan warriors had fallen with him. Women gathered in the streets, weeping for their sons and husbands. But among the Spartan elders, there were no tears, only cold silence. When the mothers of the fallen were told of their sons' deaths, many did not cry. One mother, according to legend, asked the messenger, "Did my son flee?" "No," he replied. "He fell fighting." "Then he is not dead," she said quietly. "He lives forever in Sparta." But even such stoic pride could not hide the truth. Sparta had never suffered such a loss. For generations, Their small population of citizen warriors had been the elite of Greece. Now that core was broken. The manpower that gave Sparta its supremacy was gone, and would never return. In the days after the battle, the survivors limped home. They carried the wounded king's body wrapped in a blood-stained cloak. The sight that awaited them in Sparta was not one of triumphal processions, but of silence and shame. Tradition dictated that any army returning defeated was to enter the city at night, unseen by the public. For the first time in centuries, the once proud warriors obeyed that rule. In Thebes, however, the mood was electric. Bells rang. Fires were lit on the city walls. The people celebrated through the night, praising Epaminondas and Pelopidas as saviors of Greece. The victory at Leuctra had changed everything. No longer was Thebes merely another city-state. It was now the strongest power in the Hellenic world. But Epaminondas himself did not celebrate. While others drank and sang, he stood alone on the balcony of the Theban citadel, looking out over the sleeping city. The night air was cool, and the stars glittered faintly above. Victory had come, but at a cost. He thought of the men who had died to make it possible, the sacred band, many of whom now lay buried beneath the fields of Leuctra. Lovers, brothers, friends, men who had given their lives not for wealth or conquest, but for freedom. Pelopidas joined him quietly. "You're not celebrating," he said. "There's nothing to celebrate," Epaminondas replied. "We've broken Sparta, yes, but what will we do with that power? Greece has never known peace for long. Today they cheer our names. Tomorrow, they may curse them." He was right. The victory at Leuctra did not bring peace. It brought instability. Thebes now stood at the center of a shifting world. Cities once fearful of Sparta now feared Thebes. Alliances fractured. Armies prepared. In the months that followed, Epaminondas led campaigns across the Peloponnesus. Thebes freed Messenia, a region enslaved by Sparta for centuries. When the freed Messenians built their new city, they named it Messene, and the walls stretched high and proud, a symbol of liberation. For the first time in history, Sparta found itself trapped within its own borders, surrounded by enemies it could no longer control. The once invincible city was now a fortress of ghosts. And yet, deep within its walls, the Spartan spirit did not die quietly. Generals drilled new recruits, boys of 15-handed spears too heavy for their hands. The elders swore that one day, the gods would restore Sparta's glory. But Greece was changing. Warfare had changed. Epaminondas had rewritten the very rules of combat. The oblique formation, his innovation at Leuctra, became a model studied by future generals for centuries. Even Alexander the Great, decades later, would learn from his strategies. Still, the personal cost weighed heavily on him. In every campaign, every decision, Epaminondas carried the memory of Leuctra. The blood, the screams, the fallen friends. He had broken Sparta's chains but bound himself to the endless cycle of Greek wars. One evening, as he walked through the agora of Thebes, a young boy approached him. "My father died at Leuctra," the boy said. "He said you would make Greece free." Epaminondas knelt and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Freedom," he said softly, "is never free, but your father's courage gave it meaning." In that moment, he understood that true victory wasn't measured in the number of enemies defeated, but in the legacy that outlasted the pain. The Battle of Leuctra had ended in a single day, but its echoes would haunt Greece for generations. The sun had barely risen above the plains of Leuctra when the battlefield turned into a nightmare of bronze and blood. The Spartan formation, so feared across the ancient world, began to waver, something unthinkable in the age of Leonidas. The Theban phalanx, dense and deliberate, pushed forward like a living wall of vengeance. At its head, Epaminondas led the sacred band, a unit of 300 warriors bound not only by oaths but by love, a brotherhood that turned courage into fanaticism. The left wing of the Theban army struck with the full force of concentrated power. Instead of spreading his troops evenly, Epaminondas had placed his best men, the sacred band and elite hoplites, in a massive column 50 ranks deep. He knew that if he could break the Spartan right flank, the entire formation would crumble. It was a gamble, a rejection of centuries of Greek military convention. But this time, genius favored the bold. The Spartan right, commanded by King Cleombrotus himself, braced for the impact. Shields locked, spears leveled. For a brief moment, both sides stood frozen, two walls of men staring into eternity. Then, the earth shook. The Theban charge slammed into the Spartan line with a roar that echoed across Boeotia. Spears splintered. Shields groaned under the weight. Men screamed. The first Spartan ranks held barely. Cleombrotus fought near the front, his crimson cloak torn, his bronze armor dented. He killed 2 men in quick succession, but the pressure was overwhelming. The Thebans advanced with terrifying coordination, step by step, their spears thrusting in unison. The sound of iron striking iron merged with the low hum of thousands of men straining for survival. For years, the Spartans had believed themselves invincible. From Thermopylae to Plataea, from the Peloponnesian War to countless skirmishes, they had stood as the ultimate warriors of Greece. But that day at Leuctra, they faced something different. Not an army of numbers, but an army of purpose. Epaminondas had transformed Thebes from a humiliated city into a crucible of revolution. As the hours dragged on, the balance began to shift. The Theban left wing pushed harder and harder, forcing the Spartan elite backward. The famous discipline of the Lacedaemonians began to falter. Dust and blood filled the air. The shouts of officers were drowned out by the chaos. And then, amid the melee, King Cleombrotus fell, pierced by multiple spears. His body collapsed under the crush of men, trampled by both friend and foe. When word spread that the king was dead, panic rippled through the Spartan line. Commanders tried to rally their men, but fear, that forbidden emotion in Spartan training, began to seep through the ranks. The Thebans sensed it. Epaminondas gave the order to advance again. The phalanx surged forward, driving deep into the heart of the enemy formation. The Spartan right collapsed. Their famed hoplites, the same who once stood against the might of Persia, now fled. The center followed soon after, despite desperate attempts by Spartan officers to hold formation. For the first time in centuries, Sparta, the city that prided itself on never retreating, was breaking. The field of Leuctra became a graveyard of heroes. Thousands lay dead or dying, their armor glinting beneath the afternoon sun. The Thebans, though victorious, paid a heavy price as well. But among them, a realization grew. They had done the impossible. They had broken the legend. When the surviving Spartans fled the field, the shame was unbearable. Back in Laconia, mothers who had once praised their sons for dying in battle now wept in silence. The words of their ancestors, "Return with your shield or on it," had turned to ashes. Epaminondas, standing amid the wreckage, did not gloat. He looked across the blood-soaked plain and saw the end of an era. Sparta's dominance was finished. The gods, it seemed, had shifted their favor. But victory brought more than glory. It brought change. With Sparta's power shattered, the balance of Greece transformed overnight. Thebes rose as the new master of the Hellenic world, its influence stretching across the Peloponnese. The once feared Spartan army could no longer project strength beyond its borders. Even its enslaved population, the Helots, began to whisper of rebellion. Epaminondas marched south into the Peloponnese, something no army had dared to do in generations. His soldiers entered Laconia itself, an unthinkable act, and freed thousands of Helots. He founded the city of Megalopolis to serve as a barrier against Spartan resurgence and re-established Messenia, Sparta's ancient enemy, as an independent state. It was the final humiliation. The very land that had once fed Spartan power was now lost forever. Meanwhile, in Sparta, the aftermath was chaos. The city that had never been conquered was now a shadow of itself. Without manpower, wealth, or allies, it turned inward, clinging to fading traditions. The Spartan kingship became divided, the agoge weakened, and even the once unbreakable bond among its warriors began to fracture. In Athens and beyond, the news spread like wildfire. The invincible Spartans were no more. Playwrights and philosophers debated the meaning of their fall. Was it fate, hubris, or the inevitable decline of tyranny? To the rest of Greece, It was both a warning and a spectacle. Even the strongest walls crumble when arrogance blinds the soul. And yet, amidst all this political upheaval, the legend of the Spartan warrior endured. Songs were written about the men who died standing, about Cleombrotus and the 700 elite who refused to flee even as the rest broke ranks. They died the way Spartans were meant to, facing forward, spears raised, until their last breath. As night fell on the ruins of Leuctra, Epaminondas ordered the dead to be buried with honor, both Theban and Spartan alike. The moon rose over the silent battlefield, casting long shadows over broken shields and fallen banners. The wind carried the scent of iron and the whispers of history. It was not just the end of a battle. It was the end of an age. When the survivors returned to Sparta, they brought more than wounds, they brought questions. What did it mean to be Spartan now, when fear had entered their hearts? Could the city rebuild its honor, or had the gods turned away for good? In the temples, priests lit fires and prayed to Ares and Apollo for guidance. But the silence that answered spoke louder than any oracle. The flame of Sparta, once blazing across the ancient world, flickered faintly in the wind. In Thebes, celebrations erupted, but Epaminondas remained solemn. "We have broken their bodies," he told his generals, "but their legend will outlive us all." He was right. For centuries to come, even after Thebes itself fell, the story of Sparta, its rise, its glory, and its fall at Leuctra, would be remembered as a parable of power and pride. A reminder that no empire, however disciplined or divine it may seem, can escape the weight of time and the will of destiny. And so, under the blood-red sky of Boeotia, as the stars appeared one by one, the ghosts of Sparta stood silently, watching their legacy fade into legend. In the wake of Leuctra, the Greek world trembled. The ground that had drunk the blood of Sparta's finest warriors became a symbol, not of Theban triumph alone, but of the mortality of greatness itself. No empire, no city-state, no warrior ethos was immune to decay. Sparta's defeat sent shockwaves through every polis, every council, every army that once looked to the crimson-cloaked soldiers of Laconia as the pinnacle of military perfection. When the survivors limped home, they were not greeted with honor. The women of Sparta, once known for their stoic pride, refused to meet their eyes. For centuries, the city had taught its people that survival was shameful if it came without victory. But now, there were no victors to welcome, only hollow men burdened by failure. King Agesilaus, aging and frail, received the grim news in silence. The defeat at Leuctra had undone everything he had fought to preserve. Sparta's alliances disintegrated overnight. Corinth, Arcadia, and even longtime allies began to side with Thebes. The once mighty Spartan diplomacy that had dictated Greek affairs now found itself isolated. Its envoys ignored, its threats mocked. Epaminondas, meanwhile, returned to Thebes as a living legend. His name spread across the Greek world, a man who had defeated Sparta on its own terms. But while the people cheered, he remained troubled. He had seen what victory cost, the fields littered with corpses, the echo of dying men calling for their gods. He knew that every triumph carved its own tombstone. Yet his mission was far from over. In 370 BC, he led another campaign south, this time into the very heart of Laconia. It was an act of audacity that the Greeks had believed impossible for centuries. The Theban army crossed the Eurotas River, entering the valley where no foreign army had ever dared to tread. For generations, Sparta had relied on fear to keep its borders safe. Now, as Theban soldiers marched through the countryside, burning estates and freeing helots, that fear was gone. The enslaved population, who had long lived under the iron heel of Spartan masters, rose in rebellion. Epaminondas gave them freedom and land, a symbolic dagger into the heart of Spartan pride. He then founded two cities, Megalopolis and Mycenae. These were not just urban centers, they were fortresses of independence, designed to ensure that Sparta would never rise again. Mycenae, in particular, was built upon the soil once farmed by Spartan helots, a living monument to their emancipation. For Sparta, it was a humiliation beyond words. The men who returned from Leuctra had already carried the stain of defeat. Now they watched helplessly as the very foundation of their power, the Helot labor system, collapsed before their eyes. The proud city of warriors had become defenseless. Surrounded by enemies it could no longer intimidate. The once mighty training grounds where boys had been forged into living weapons fell silent. The Agoge, Sparta's brutal military education system, began to crumble as fewer and fewer citizens could afford to send their sons. The population of true Spartans, the Spartiates, dwindled, replaced by lesser classes and foreign mercenaries. By the time of Alexander the Great, only a few hundred full citizens remained. But even in decline, the Spartan spirit refused to die. In the smoky halls of the city, elders still told stories of Leonidas and the 300, of Thermopylae and Plataea. They clung to their past like a sacred flame, believing that as long as those tales were told, Sparta would live on. Meanwhile, in Thebes, Epaminondas began to sense that his victory had created more enemies than it destroyed. Athens, once a reluctant ally, grew fearful of Theban dominance. The delicate balance of Greek politics began to shift once again. Thebes had inherited Sparta's mantle of power, and, with it, Sparta's curse. In 362 BC, at the Battle of Mantinea, the cycle came full circle. Epaminondas once again faced an alliance of Greek states, this time including Sparta and Athens together. It was the final act of the tragic play that began at Leuctra. On the battlefield, amid the chaos of shields and spears, the Theban general led his troops with unmatched courage, until a spear pierced his chest. As he fell, his officers rushed to his side. "Have I left Thebes strong?" he asked. When they told him yes, that the city had triumphed once again, he smiled faintly and replied, "Then I die content." And with that, the man who had broken Sparta's back took his last breath. His death marked not only the end of Theban supremacy but the beginning of a new age. Without Epaminondas, Greece slid once more into chaos. City turned against city, alliance against alliance, until the Macedonian tide, led by Philip II and later Alexander the Great, swept over them all. Sparta, though broken, endured. It never regained its former glory, but it survived as a symbol, austere, defiant, frozen in the past. Its warriors continued to train. Its laws remained harsh, its pride unbroken even as its power faded. Visitors from across Greece came to see the ruins and the men who still called themselves Spartans, the ghosts of an age that refused to die. Centuries later, Roman generals would visit the valley of the Eurotas and marvel at its simplicity. The people of Sparta, they noted, still lived without walls, still trained their sons to fight, still spoke with the same laconic brevity that had once terrified kings. Even stripped of empire, they were unyielding. And perhaps that was the greatest legacy of all, not conquest, not power, but endurance. The Spartans had been defeated on the battlefield, but their name endured through millennia. Their discipline, their courage, their unwavering devotion to the state, these became myths that transcended history itself. Even today, the word Spartan evokes more than a people. It represents an idea, the belief that strength is not in numbers but in will, that honor can outlive defeat, that even in the darkest hour, there is nobility in standing firm. The Battle of Leuctra was not merely the fall of Sparta. It was a mirror held up to humanity, a reminder that arrogance, no matter how disciplined or divine, always meets its reckoning. But it was also proof that courage, even in failure, can echo through eternity. As the centuries passed, poets, historians, and generals returned to that blood-soaked plain in Boeotia. They stood where Cleombrotus fell and where Epaminondas changed the course of history. The grass had long since grown over the bones, but the silence there carried weight. The silence of men who had fought to define the meaning of valor. And so the legend endures. The story of Leuctra, of 10,000 Spartans against 6,000 Thebans, remains one of the great turning points of history. It is the tale of how the greatest warriors of their age were brought low, not by numbers, but by strategy, unity, and destiny. In the end, it was not just Sparta that died at Leuctra, it was the illusion of invincibility. From that day on, every empire that rose remembered the lesson written in Spartan blood. Pride builds monuments, but humility preserves them. The wind still whispers across the hills of Boeotia, carrying with it echoes of that final clash. The clatter of shields, the cries of men, the silence that follows, and somewhere, beyond the veil of time, the spirits of Sparta march still, not in triumph, but in memory. For while cities crumble and empires fade, legends never die.